Hi everyone, Carl Steele here, English Formal 1-3, Class 18 on the last chunk of Equiano's interesting narrative. I've got an image here of a shipwreck taken from the enrichment for children of Equiano's interesting narrative. Shipwreck is, of course, a constant source of peril for Equiano because he's forced to go out to sea to earn his living constantly because he can't find steady income in England. And it's also, of course, a metaphor for the way that his life goes frequently in this book. He never knows when the storms are going to take him and nearly kill him. So it's something you may want to pay attention to as you're reading through this book. I'm going to call attention to a variety of various things for understanding Equiano's work in this little talk today. I'm going to try to keep it shorter than usual. First, I just want to think again about the cover page and the various forms of property that we have on it. And I'm just going to ask you maybe to think about all the ways this is intersecting on here. First of all, of course, there's self-ownership. Equiano tells us that when he buys himself, he is now his own master, which establishes a strange relationship of ownership towards himself, not of full liberation, but of self-ownership. And we can think whether that's a key feature of how we understand the self in what we might loosely call Western thinking. Is it a form of self-ownership or is it a form of liberation? We can also notice, too, that Equiano is letting us know that he had professionals do this. We have the names of the painter, a person named William Denton, Pinxit, it says in Latin, and the engraver, Daniel Orme, over here. And if you click on that link in the PowerPoint, which I'll upload to Blackboard, you can see a set of other works that Daniel Orme did of famous people and also not so famous people. Then we have the Bible quoted here from the Christian scriptures, Acts 4, chapter 4, verse 5, which is a verse he cites on page 189 and then quotes several pages later. Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. That's from the translation of the Bible sponsored by King James in the early 17th century. And so here's a sense of whose name he belongs to, whose name he's traveling under, who owns him, and that's God and God alone. And so it's a different form of self-ownership or self-abandonment. Then we have, of course, his various names, Olata Equiano, which is the African name, or Gustavus Vasa, which is increasingly getting the sense that that is his legal name, the African, but the African is linked not to Equiano, but to Gustavus Vasa. But we have three different scripts, but notice that the cursive script, we can call it, is linked to Equiano. So this is a very complicated set of words. And maybe someone may want to write about that. And then at the bottom, published March 1st, 1789 by G. Vasa. That's a long S, of course. So that's not an F, F-A-S-S-A. And so here he is signing his name ultimately once more. So many names, references to God, references to himself under a variety of names, Olata Equiano, Gustavus Vasa, the African, G. Vasa. And how are all these functioning together? And we'll talk about that tomorrow in class. Now, I want to point out something else in terms of understanding the way this book works. I've been talking about the lack of a clear narrative trajectory. And again, I've pointed you out to Frank Wilderson III's book, Afro-Pessimism, and how he argues that a clear sense of life trajectory, where there's a clear relationship between effort put in and the outcome, is something that's denied to African Americans, where the Black experience, as Wilderson explains it, is one of who knows what's going to happen tomorrow, right? And we see this happen with Equiano in this book frequently. He believes that he's a free man and he's constantly being kidnapped, nearly drawn back into slavery, beaten, even quite late in the book, as late as chapter 11, he's beaten terribly and treated as an enslaved person. He works for his money, both as an enslaved person and as a free man, and people are constantly ripping him off and telling him that as a Black man, he's got no way to complain. He recommends a friend to take a job that he had once he has to leave it. And that friend is kidnapped into slavery. And Equiano tries a variety of tricks to try to rescue his friend. He even wears whiteface, and it doesn't work, right? And if this were shaped as a novel, we'd have a very different kind of narrative trajectory. But because he's giving us the life, and he's giving us the life of a Black man, we're going to have a lot more chaos and uncertainty in it. And so I can point out then that the kind of features of this book that were, it seems there's a lot of material that goes nowhere, again, I think represents deliberately the Black experience in the 18th century and indeed through to the present day. So sometimes we have things like this, the discussion of the sheep of Turkey. The tails of the sheep are flat and so very large, ba, 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 ba. What does this have to do with anything? It's just kind of an interesting travel narrative, but it also isn't that interesting. It's just something he drops in. Again, the kind of incoherence of the book, I think, is deliberate. It represents something about his experience. We can point out some other dramatic events. There's a poisoned fish on 218. But then the key undramatic event is when he is imagining encountering Pascal again, and then what actually happens. So when he achieves his freedom, he really just imagines that he's going to track him down. And he says, if it pleased God, I would see old England once more and surprise my old master, Captain Pascal, who was hourly in my mind, for I still loved him, notwithstanding his usage to me, and I pleased myself with thinking of what he would say when he saw what the Lord had done for me in so short a time, instead of being, as he might perhaps suppose, under the cruel yoke of some planter. He imagines that Pascal would be pleased that Equiano has done so well for himself. I think he just wants to show off and say, look what you tried to do to me and look who I am now, right? Understandable. With these kinds of reveries, I often use to entertain myself and shorten the time till my return. And now being as in my original free African state, I embarked on board, etc. He goes to England and finds him. And so he meets up with the sisters who were so kind to him. And then they say their cousin, Captain Pascal, was mean to him. And then Pascal visited his cousins quite often. And so Equiano meets him again 4 or 5 days later after in Greenwich Park. When he saw me, he appeared a good deal surprised and asked me how I came back. I answered, in a ship. To which he replied dryly, I suppose he did not walk back to London on the water, as I saw by his manner that he did not seem to be sorry for his behavior to me, and that I had not much reason to expect any favor from him. I told him that he had used me very ill after I'd been such a faithful servant to him for so many years, on which, without saying any more, he turned about and went away. And we'll talk about that tomorrow in class, with the disappointment of this scene and the absolute wall that he hits in what would have been in a Hollywood film a wonderful moment of insult, right? It just is telling us that this really is not a novel, and particularly that it's not even the life of a white person who expects to be able to have things turn out their way. Okay, so that's important. Something else for understanding this book is to think about Equiano's reading. He tells us a little bit about it, and we can also see what he's quoting in it. He quotes from Milton's Paradise Lost at various points in poetry, and also in chapter 10, which is a long chapter about his conversion to a form of Christianity, that he talks about receiving a book called, as he says, The Conversion of an Indian. And I believe it's this book here, The Conversion of an Indian in a Letter to a Friend. And I have the third edition here from 1778. It's published in America. There's also a version published in German, also in America, because German was an important language in Pennsylvania at the time. And one of the things that Equiano may have learned from this book is how to talk about things as if they're completely strange to him, because it's told in the voice of a Native American, and it's perhaps the man Harlow who wrote it. Maybe he was Native American. I couldn't find any more information about it in my brief research on it. But here he describes the Indian of the work describes going to a church in England. First, he sailed over to England, and he's been struck by the way all the sailors blaspheme constantly, and he thinks they don't believe in any God whatsoever, or they don't respect their God. This already sounds like Equiano. And then he goes to church. I went with a guide to a place called a church, at the entrance of which I was a little surprised at the largeness of the company. I followed my host till he came to the middle of the place, when I saw a tall man covered with a long white garment from his shoulders down to his feet, and with an audible voice he read in a large book that lay open before him. He's a preacher, right? He's describing a preacher who's wearing a vestment, a particular kind of garb, professional garb. Many of the people in the place had a small book in their hands, and sometimes they read aloud an answer to the man in the white garment. At other times, he and they spoke together. After this, the tall man put off the long white covering, and then from his shoulders down, he was blacker than any of us Indians. So he's not talking about black skin here. He's talking about black clothing. And again, he's describing a vestment in a way of an outsider, someone who's estranged for this moment, and asking us as readers to feel slightly estranged from what is familiar to us, to see things from the perspective of an Indian, to inhabit the body in the mind of that person as they're about to be converted. Equiano, of course, resorts to such effects frequently, particularly in the first 2 chapters of this work. And then whenever he encounters something new, he uses these techniques of estrangement, both to ask us to inhabit that body that he's in, to share his mind with him, right? Which has an interesting effect on the white reader, but also to offer the air of truth to what he's saying. He's saying, I didn't recognize these things. They were new to me. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But I think he may have learned some of the ways of doing that from a book like this. I think by reading the things that Equiano read, we can learn a great deal more about him. And so that's something maybe you want to think about for writing about in your next paper. So let me offer up 2 more things. One, I'm going to talk about religion. And he has in chapter 10 this an enormous discussion of his conversion, of his feeling completely bereft, on the verge. He just wants death for himself, and he thinks he's the worst sinner who's ever lived. This is all incredibly familiar if you were raised in an evangelical Christian household, as I was, and you read, say, works like by John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress. He also wrote a book in 1666 called Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, in a faithful account of the life and death of John Bunyan, or a brief relation of the exceeding mercy of God in Christ to him, namely, in his taking him out of the dunghill and converting of him to the faith of his blessed Son, Jesus Christ, etc. So this is a later edition published in 1716 after Bunyan's death. And the feature of this work is that Bunyan is describing himself as the worst sinner who has ever lived. And he talks about the way that he feels completely wretched. He does this over the course of about 150 pages, and is constantly maybe feeling saved and then feeling like he should die because he's the worst person who's ever lived. This should be familiar to you because you've read exactly that same emotional trajectory in chapter 10 of Equiano's interesting narrative. So here is Bunyan writing. I found it a hard work now to pray to God because despair was swallowing me up. I thought I was as with a tempest driven away from God. Notice that shipwreck metaphor. For always when I cried to God for mercy, this would come in. 'Tis too late. I am lost. God hath let me fall, not to my correction, but to my condemnation. My sin is unpardonable. And I know concerning Esau, know that after he'd sold his birthright, he would have received a blessing, but was rejected. And so this fear and this total crushing weight of this personal encounter with the terror and majesty of God is something that Equiano must have had in mind in writing chapter 10. Had he read Bunyan? Maybe, maybe not, but he certainly read and talked to people who talked in the ways that Bunyan did, because here is a bit of how Equiano talks. So I'm going to come back to that phenomenon just at the end of this slide. I wish to be anything but a human being, he writes. I hated all things and wished I'd never been born. Confusion seized me, and I wished to be annihilated. Now, this again is all in the chapter about his conversion to Christianity, to his full conversion, his being born again. Now my whole wish was to be dissolved and to be with Christ, but alas, I must wait for my appointed time. It's a form of death that he's longing for. He's wishing he could get there. And so what I'm going to propose is that he has a couple of options. One is the feeling of being a Black man in a white world, which is a feeling of either accepting that quality of being the worst person who's ever lived in a white world, or a feeling of non-existence, what Frantz Fanon calls in Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, Black Skin's White Mask. Fanon writes, a feeling of inferiority? No, it's a feeling of non-existence. Sin is Negro as virtue is white. All those white men in a group, guns in their hands, cannot be wrong. I am guilty. I do not know what, but I know that I am no good, right? Fanon is writing against that. He's trying to resist that. And Equiano, I think, is trying to resist that as well. And the way he chooses that, finds one to resist that, is to become a Christian and to have a different feeling of inferiority, one of an inferiority not to white people who are clearly flawed, but an inferiority to God, and to feel like he wants to die, but now he's going to die in God, in the service of God, and not in the service of flawed human beings. I think this is key to understanding the way that his conversion is working. And so he becomes so much so that he ceases to become a civilized person. He says, I became a barbarian to them, to the other Christian white sailors, so-called Christian white sailors, in talking of the love of Christ. He talks about God so much that they find him off-putting, but he's clinging to his Christianity, understandably, right? Because it gives him a form of belonging, even if it's a form of belonging that's about being the property of a God, right? Rather than the victim of a group of flawed people. So I think that's maybe the psychology of what's happening there in chapter 10. I also just want to call attention to one last thing, and we'll talk about this in more detail tomorrow, is the various ways that he also identifies with whiteness in various ways. Of course, we see, quite disappointingly, that he enslaves people, that he wants to have a plantation, that when he obtains his freedom, he is actually looking forward to owning other Black people, and that when he has this plantation in Central America, and it fails, but he is, in fact, does own people, and he trades in them. So that's a way that he is seeking the wages of whiteness. He talks about old England. He identifies with England as the place that he's from. Not, of course, that he actually is, but he sees it as a place of safety and a place of identification. And then he has this strange moment where a Native American boy who's on ship with him calls him a white man. Equiano is surrounded by sailors who are cursing, taking the name of God in vain, drinking, carrying on. And Equiano, being at this point a holy man, a Christian man who will not stop talking about God, is an alien to these other white men. And the Indian boy notices the difference. And he says, at last, he asked me, how comes it that all the white men on board who can read and write and observe the sun and know all things, yet swear, lie, and get drunk, only excepting yourself? I answered him, the reason was that they did not fear God, and that if any one of them died so, they could not go to or he happy with God, or be happy with God. So what is happening when this Indian calls Equiano a white man? He is understanding that whiteness is not about skin color. It's about a certain position of power, of technology, of clothing, right? And we see that Equiano continues to look like a white man in the way that he beholds things like a white man when we have this ethnographic gaze applied to the natives of Central America. He's describing them in a way that as a stranger, but as a stranger in exactly the same way that a white man might look at them. Or perhaps he doesn't, and we can talk about that tomorrow in class. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation.